When my grandmother died, the rest of my family scattered like startled birds. No one wanted to speak of her house, much less step foot on that land again. The estate had always stood apart from everything else. Miles of isolation, a forest that crept up against the rotting fence lines, and a mansion that seemed to breathe with its own malignant rhythm. The will was read in a small office downtown. My uncles and aunts shifted in their seats, their eyes darting anywhere but the lawyer's folder. None of them wanted responsibility. None of them wanted to acknowledge the strings tied to her name. So when my name was spoken, when the burden fell squarely onto me, I didn't even have time to protest. Their sighs of relief drowned out the words forming in my throat. The house was mine. Or rather, the house had chosen me. The lawyer leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as if the details unsettled even him. "Your grandmother left behind instructions," he said. "They're unusual. She insisted they be delivered only to you." He slid an envelope across the polished desk. It was thick, sealed with crimson wax stamped in the shape of a cross-like emblem I didn't recognize. The sight of it unsettled me, though I tried not to show it. My cousins whispered to each other behind me, muttering about curses, about family madness. I ignored them, shoved the envelope into my jacket, and signed the papers that would make the house legally mine. When I walked out, the sky was the color of old iron, clouds pressing down like a warning. The drive to the estate was long and hollow. Each mile I put between myself and the city seemed to drain the warmth from the world. By the time I reached the dirt road leading to the front gates, daylight had already dulled to ash. The gates stood half collapsed, their metal twisted by rust and neglect. My grandmother hadn't left this place in years, and it showed. I pushed through the gates in my car, the crunch of gravel under my tires echoing like brittle bones snapping. The trees leaned inward, branches scraping the roof as if trying to drag me back. For the first time, I considered turning around. No one would blame me, but something in my chest, a mixture of pride and stubbornness, kept me moving forward. The house loomed ahead, its silhouette jagged against the horizon. Tall, narrow windows stared like unblinking eyes. The roof sagged where the beams had given way, and the paint had peeled until the walls looked diseased. This was no home. It was a carcass left behind by time, and now it belonged to me. When I stepped out of the car, the silence was suffocating. No birds, no insects, no wind. Just the groan of the house, as if it sensed fresh blood had arrived. I carried my single suitcase up the cracked stone steps. The front door was heavy, darker than the rest of the structure, and fitted with a brass handle dulled to green. It took both hands to push it open, and when I did, the stench of mold, dust, and something sharper, like iron, rolled over me. The foyer yawned before me. The floor was tiled in black and white squares, cracked and uneven. A grand staircase rose into shadows above, its banister draped with cobwebs. The portraits of ancestors hung crooked on the walls, their eyes catching faint light, gleaming wet. For a moment, I swore they were following me. I set my suitcase down and pulled the envelope from my pocket. My fingers trembled as I broke the seal. Inside was a folded parchment, the edges yellow and brittle. My grandmother's handwriting scrawled across the page, jagged and forceful despite the weakness of her final years. It began with a single line. "If you are reading this, the house has accepted you. You will obey its rules or you will die." The words struck me cold. Beneath them, the list began. 10 rules, each short but dripping with menace. My throat went dry as I read them once, then again, trying to understand if this was some elaborate joke. But the way the ink cut into the paper told me she had meant every word. I didn't speak them aloud. I couldn't. The silence of the house seemed to lean closer, listening. I folded the letter back into the envelope, slid it into my coat, and tried to calm my racing heart. Rules or not, I was here now. I couldn't just walk away, not with the eyes of the family on me, waiting for me to fail. I wandered deeper into the house. The floors groaned beneath my steps. Every doorway opened into another cavern of dust and cobwebs. The kitchen smelled faintly of rotted meat, though no food remained. The dining hall was lined with a table long enough to seat 30, but the chairs were overturned, some splintered as if broken during a struggle. I climbed the staircase. my hand sliding along the banister, sticky with age. Upstairs, the air was heavier, thicker. I felt it pressing into my chest, as though the house itself wanted me gone. I chose a bedroom near the end of the hall, one with a door that still locked. The bed sagged in the middle, the sheets eaten by moths, but it was better than nothing. I dropped my suitcase on the floor and sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the cracked wallpaper. My grandmother had lived here until her last breath. Had she been alone? Or had the house kept her company in ways no one else would understand? Night fell quickly. The last light drained from the windows, leaving the room steeped in shadow. I lit a candle from my bag, the tiny flame trembling against the dark. The envelope felt heavy in my pocket, like it was burning against my chest. I wanted to read the rules again, but I was afraid of memorizing them, afraid of what that meant. Instead, I lay back on the bed, shoes still on, candle burning low beside me. The silence of the house was absolute, until it wasn't. A creak on the floorboards outside my door. Slow, deliberate. Then another. My breath hitched. I told myself it was the wood settling, but the steps grew closer, deliberate as a heartbeat. They stopped outside my room. The handle rattled. Once, twice. Then slowly, almost carefully, it twisted downward, but I had locked the door. The latch held. The handle stilled. Silence reclaimed the hall. I didn't sleep. Not really. I lay awake, eyes fixed on the dark ceiling, listening to the house breathe. Every shadow looked deeper, heavier. The candle guttered, then went out, and I felt the cold settle into my bones. By dawn, I knew one thing for certain. The rules weren't a warning. They were a promise, and I was already breaking them. By morning, I had almost convinced myself that what happened during the night was just my imagination. Exhaustion, stress, the kind of paranoia that creeps in when you spend your first night in a place like this. That's what I told myself as the pale light bled through the curtains, gray and weak like it was struggling to survive the weight of the clouds outside. But when I pulled the envelope from my coat again, that fragile hope shriveled. The paper felt heavier, almost damp, as though it had been absorbing the breath of the house overnight. My grandmother's handwriting stared back at me, sharp and frantic. Each letter pressed so deep into the parchment that it had nearly cut through. I sat on the edge of the bed, the floorboards groaning under my weight, and began to read the rules carefully, one by one. The first was simple, but no less unnerving. Do not open the east-facing windows after dusk. I remembered the windows in the foyer, tall and cracked, their glass clouded with grime. I wondered what she had seen through them, what pressed its face to that glass. The second, never leave a mirror uncovered after sunset. I thought of the hallway upstairs, lined with warped mirrors framed in gilded wood. I had seen my reflection flicker in one as I passed. Now I pictured dozens of reflections crawling out of their glass prisons after dark. The third, always light the lanterns at midnight. Everyone. That explained the brass lanterns I'd noticed scattered throughout the house, their glass smudged with soot. There must have been a dozen of them, if not more. Why light them? What waited for the moment the house fell fully dark? The fourth, never enter the locked northern wing. My eyes lingered on that one. During my brief wandering the night before, I had seen the chains on those doors. What lay behind them that even my grandmother feared? The fifth, do not speak your name aloud in the graveyard. My grandmother was buried on the hill above the estate, alongside the rest of our ancestors. I felt a chill reading that line. Why my name? Why anyone's name? The sixth, never fall asleep in the dining hall. I thought of the overturned chairs, the massive table still marked with faint scratches. I shuddered to imagine what had feasted there when the house went silent. The seventh, feed the fire in the kitchen hearth once every 3 nights. It must never go cold. There was no explanation, only command. I hadn't even checked the hearth yet. I wondered what was buried in the ashes. The eighth, do not answer if someone knocks on the windows after midnight. My stomach twisted. It wasn't if, it was when. The way she wrote it. She knew it would happen. The ninth, do not follow the sound of your mother's voice. My chest tightened at that one. My mother had died years ago, long before my grandmother. She had grown up here in this house. Did the house remember her too? And the 10th, scrawled so violently that the ink had bled through the back of the paper. If the rules contradict, choose survival. The house will punish hesitation. I read them twice, then a third time, until the words seemed to whisper themselves into the walls. I could feel the rules sinking into me, clinging like a parasite. They weren't instructions, they were shackles. My grandmother hadn't survived here by choice. She had obeyed, she had endured, and now so would I. I folded the parchment carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and pressed it against my chest. My hands were trembling. When I finally rose, I decided to explore more of the estate. The house stretched far deeper than I realized. Hall after hall, each lined with doors leading to rooms filled with dust and forgotten relics. My grandmother's touch lingered everywhere. Quilts eaten by moths. Shelves lined with books whose spines cracked when I opened them. Trunks stuffed with photographs of strangers whose faces blurred with decay. I found the kitchen, its stone hearth blackened and cold. Above it hung iron pots so rusted they looked like they had bled. A pile of ash still clung inside the fireplace, faint and gray. I thought of the 7th rule. 3 nights, it had said. Had my grandmother tended this fire until her last breath? And what happened on the night she couldn't? I opened the back door, stepping briefly into the garden. The air was damp, thick with the smell of rotting leaves. The well stood at the center, its stones slick with moss. A wooden cover had been placed across the top, bound tight with rope. The rope was frayed but not broken. My grandmother had wanted it sealed. I didn't linger. Even in daylight, the well radiated unease, as though something inside it was listening. The rest of the day passed in uneasy silence. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing behind me. But the halls remained empty, the air heavy with the weight of centuries. I busied myself with small tasks, sweeping dust, prying open windows for air, stacking broken chairs in the hall. But when dusk fell, the house changed. The light that filtered through the windows shifted from gray to sickly green, and the air thickened until every breath felt forced. I hurried to cover the mirrors with tattered sheets I found in the closets. My reflection shimmered faintly as I hid it away, its eyes seeming to linger half a second too long. I lit the lanterns before midnight, each flame sputtering against the stale air. Their glow barely reached the corners of the halls, but I felt less suffocated with each one that burned. I counted them, 12 lanterns in total, one for each major hallway and stairwell. When I lit the last, the house seemed to sigh, as though appeased. I locked myself in my bedroom again that night, the envelope beneath my pillow, my ears tuned to every creak and whisper. And just past midnight, the knocking began. It was faint at first, on the east-facing windows downstairs. 3 knocks, slow, deliberate. I froze, the blood draining from my body. Another set followed, louder this time, knuckles rapping against glass, insistent. I held my breath, remembering the 8th rule. Never answer, never acknowledge. The knocking traveled, from one window to another, closer, climbing, until it was just outside my room. I stared at the dark outline of the window across from my bed, the candle guttering beside me. The glass quivered with each knock, steady, rhythmic, as though the thing outside knew exactly where I was. Then a voice called my name. My mother's voice, soft, gentle, familiar in a way that made my bones ache. Let me in. I buried my face in the pillow, tears welling in my eyes. My heart screamed to answer, but the 9th rule roared in my head. Do not follow the sound of your mother's voice. I clutched the envelope tighter, whispering the rules under my breath like a prayer, until the knocking stopped. Morning came again, but the light seemed weaker, paler. The house was awake now, and so was I. The rules weren't warnings. They were commandments, and breaking them wasn't an option. The second night was worse than the first, though I'd prepared for it. I'd spent the entire day repeating the rules under my breath, committing them to memory, trying to see the house not as a place I owned, but as a predator I was trapped inside. The more I thought of it that way, the more it made sense. Predators had patterns. They gave warnings before striking, Maybe the rules weren't just commands. Maybe they were the scars of survival, signs my grandmother had left behind to keep me alive in a place that wanted me dead. By the time dusk fell, I had already pulled the sheets tight over every mirror upstairs. Their covered forms leaned against the walls like shrouded corpses, and I avoided looking at them too closely. Downstairs, the east-facing windows glimmered faintly with the last light of the sun, and I shut them tight, locking the latches with trembling fingers. The air thickened as the sun fell completely. My candle burned beside me as I lit the lanterns one by one, 12 little flames shivering in defiance of the dark. I whispered their count like a mantra, 1, 2, 3, until I'd made the full circuit of the house. When the last lantern flickered alive, I felt a shift in the air. The shadows pulled back, just slightly, as though they had been denied something. But the reprieve didn't last. By midnight, the silence pressed in on me, heavier than the air in a tomb. I lay awake in the bedroom I had claimed, my body refusing to rest, my mind locked in a state of alertness. I clutched the envelope beneath my pillow like a weapon, though paper could do nothing against the things that breathed in these halls. The knocking came again. This time, it started earlier, sharp raps against the glass of the east-facing windows below. I ignored them, forcing myself to breathe evenly. The rules had been clear. Don't answer. Don't acknowledge. But the knocking didn't stop. It multiplied. What began as one set of knuckles spread to others, as though every window on the east side of the house had someone, or something, standing outside, demanding entry. The rhythm of it grew sickening, almost like a heartbeat, pulsing through the walls. I pressed my palms over my ears, but I could still feel it in my bones. Then, the voices began. They didn't call my name this time. They whispered, low and urgent, words I couldn't quite make out, but which twisted into the shape of temptation. A dozen different tones layered over each other, male, female, young, old, as though the house had scraped them from my bloodline and given them back to me. I turned onto my side, pressing my face into the pillow. My grandmother's rule came back to me with clarity. Do not answer if someone knocks on the windows after midnight. She must have lived through this exact torment. The handle of my door rattled again, just like the first night. This time, the sound was accompanied by a dragging scrape, as if something was running its nails along the wood. I sat up, heart pounding, eyes locked on the trembling knob. The lantern outside in the hall flickered violently, its flame shrinking, then flaring. Shadows stretched long across the crack beneath the door, too dark, too fluid. I wanted to scream. Instead, I whispered the rules again under my breath, like they were prayers. 10 chains binding me to sanity. 10 lines between survival and annihilation. When the knocking and rattling finally subsided, I thought I'd won. I thought the rules had carried me through. But then I heard a new sound, a whisper of footsteps. Inside the room, I froze. My eyes darted to the corner, where the candle on the dresser cast its faint glow. The shadows there bent wrong, stretching upward into a figure that hadn't been there before. Tall, thin. Its head brushed the ceiling, though it didn't move, didn't breathe. The air grew colder. My teeth began to chatter. I clutched the envelope so hard that the parchment inside crumpled. The rules hadn't mentioned this. No warning about what to do if something came inside. The figure leaned forward, its face still hidden in shadow. My body screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The candle flame wavered, casting the briefest glint of features. A mouth stretched too wide, teeth that gleamed wet, eyes sunk deep like pits. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it recoiled into the dark. The shadow folded back into itself, vanishing against the corner. The air eased. The room emptied. I didn't move until dawn, when light finally seeped through the curtains, pale and sickly though it was. I realized I had been gripping the parchment so tightly that the ink had smeared onto my fingers. My grandmother's rules were etched into my skin like a curse. The house had tested me. That much I knew, and though I'd survived, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had only been the beginning. The first night was just that, a beginning. The house was patient. It would wait, and I would have to decide how long I could endure. The east-facing windows haunted me after that night. Even in daylight, I couldn't walk past them without feeling watched. The glass was warped and mottled with age, streaked with grime that no amount of scrubbing seemed to erase. But behind that filth, I sometimes caught glimpses, reflections that didn't belong to me. The fourth rule echoed in my head. Do not open the east-facing windows after dusk. It sounded simple, almost laughably so. Who would want to? The frames were swollen with damp, the latches rusted shut. But rules in this house weren't suggestions. They were lines in the sand. Cross them, and something would come through. On the third day, I found myself drawn to them anyway. The sun was still high, though the light was weak and jaundiced, casting everything in the color of spoiled milk. I stood in the foyer, staring at the row of windows that faced the tangled forest beyond the estate. My reflection glared back at me, pale and distorted, but when I blinked, it wasn't me anymore. The face on the other side of the glass was gaunt, hollow-eyed, lips stretched in a grin too wide for its skull. It pressed closer, fogging the window with its breath. I stumbled back, my pulse hammering. But the figure didn't move. It stayed there, face nearly touching the glass, that grin cutting wider. Its hands rose, splayed against the pane, long fingers curling as if testing the barrier. I fled the foyer, slamming the parlor door shut behind me, my body trembling. Even with the wood between us, I swore I could hear the faint squeak of its nails dragging against the glass. That night, the knocking started earlier. This time, it wasn't just the windows, it was the glass itself, vibrating under the pressure of something unseen. I sat in my locked bedroom, listening to the deep, deliberate thuds that traveled along the east wall of the house, like a predator circling its cage. Then came the voices again. Not my mother this time, not anyone I knew. They were strangers, hundreds of them whispering in unison, chanting words that slipped through the cracks in my mind like smoke. I covered my ears, curled against the headboard, whispering the rules again and again. The parchment beneath my pillow felt warm, pulsing as though the ink itself was alive. When morning came, I thought the ordeal was over. But curiosity has its own teeth. By the fourth day, I couldn't resist. The house was silent, the lanterns extinguished, the mirrors still covered. Sunlight, thin and lifeless, leaked through the curtains. I told myself it was safe. The rule only forbade opening the windows after dusk. It said nothing about the daylight hours. So I went back to the foyer. The east windows stood tall and warped, the glass filmed with dust. I reached out, fingers brushing the latch. It crumbled slightly under my touch, but it held. With a deep breath, I forced it upward. The window groaned, frame shrieking as it gave way. The smell hit me first, rot, damp earth, and something coppery. The forest outside seemed to lean closer, its shadows denser than they had been moments before. I leaned forward, peering into the trees. Nothing moved. No wind, no birds, only silence. Then, slowly, a figure stepped from the shadows. It was the same gaunt face I had seen in the glass, only now it had a body, long-limbed, twisted, its skin stretched tight over bone. Its grin never faltered as it walked toward the house, bare feet silent on the soil. My breath hitched. I slammed the window shut, forcing the latch down. The glass rattled violently, as though invisible hands were pounding from the outside. I staggered back, heart clawing at my ribs. The pounding followed me all the way upstairs. Even as I locked my bedroom door and collapsed against it, I could still hear it. Knuckles against glass, deliberate and patient. That night, I paid for my curiosity. The knocking didn't stop. It spread, window to window, until every east-facing pane shivered with blows. Shadows moved behind the curtains, tall and skeletal, pressing their faces against the glass. The lanterns flickered violently, nearly going out. I clutched the rules beneath my pillow, whispering them like a prayer, until sleep finally claimed me out of sheer exhaustion. When dawn came, I didn't check the windows. I didn't dare, but I knew this much. The rule wasn't just a warning. It was containment. The glass was a barrier, barely holding them back, and I had tested its strength. Now they knew I was here. Now they wanted me. The northern wing had always been the most unsettling part of the estate. Even as a child, when my parents brought me here for the rare family gatherings, I remembered being warned to stay away from that corridor. My grandmother would catch my hand in her iron grip and hiss that some doors weren't meant to open. Some halls weren't meant to echo with living footsteps. Back then, I thought she was just superstitious. Her warnings, the ramblings of an old woman desperate to keep control. But now, with her rules burned into my mind, I knew better. The fourth rule was clear. Never enter the locked northern wing, and yet every day, I felt its presence. The northern corridor stretched behind a pair of heavy oak doors bound with chains, the metal black with rust. Even in daylight, the wood seemed to pulse faintly, as if something on the other side was breathing against it. I avoided looking at it directly, but I could feel the pressure whenever I passed, like an eye staring from behind the cracks, waiting for me to falter. On the fifth night, I heard the first sounds. I had just finished my midnight ritual, trudging through the halls with my lantern, making sure each flame was lit. My hands shook as I struck the matches, my nerves frayed by nights of knocking and whispers. I was halfway back to my room when I heard it, a faint scratching. It came from behind the chained doors. The sound was small at first, like nails dragged gently along wood. But then it grew frantic, scraping hard, clawing, as though something was trying to dig its way out. I froze. My lantern flame quivered, throwing fractured shadows across the hall. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a whisper. My name. It said my name, clear as breath. In my grandmother's voice, I ran, back in my locked bedroom. I pressed my back to the door, the rules trembling in my hands. They hadn't warned me what to do if the wing called to me. They'd only forbidden entry. But the way the voice had sounded, fragile, desperate, pleading, it burrowed under my skin. By morning, I convinced myself it had been a trick. The house had tried my mother's voice before. Now it had simply chosen another. Still, curiosity gnawed at me. The northern wing was chained, sealed, forbidden. That meant it hid something crucial. And in this place, the unknown was often worse than the truth. On the sixth day, I walked the corridor again. The chains clinked faintly, though I hadn't touched them. The wood was scarred, gouged with long marks that stretched from the top to the bottom of the door. I bent close, pressing my ear against it. At first there was nothing, just silence. But then, faintly, I heard movement. A shuffle, a dragging sound like bare feet across stone. And then, breathing. Shallow, hungry. I staggered back, my heart hammering, and nearly tripped over a broken chair leg lying in the hall. I didn't linger. I fled back to the safer parts of the house, repeating the fourth rule under my breath. Never enter the locked northern wing. That night, the scratching returned. Louder this time. The chains rattled as though something inside was shaking them violently. My room was far from the northern corridor, but I could still hear it echoing through the bones of the house. I tried to bury my head under the pillow, but the sound grew sharper. And then came the sobbing. It was a child's sobs, thin, fragile, wounded. "Help me," it whispered. I cried silently into the pillow, refusing to move. The rules were clear. The rules were all I had. By dawn, the sound stopped. But the silence that followed was worse. On the seventh day, I couldn't resist anymore. I brought my lantern into the hall and stood before the chained doors, trembling. The padlock was ancient, its iron eaten with rust, but it still held fast. I reached out and touched the cold metal, and the whisper came again. This time, it wasn't my grandmother or a child. It was my own voice. "Open it," I recoiled, bile rising in my throat. My own tone, my own cadence, whispered back at me through the wood. The flame of my lantern shivered, nearly extinguished. My reflection in the brass lantern glass twisted. Grinning wide, I stumbled back, nearly dropping the lantern, and fled once more. That night, I dreamt of the wing. In my dream, the chains fell away, and the door yawned open into a black void that smelled of earth and rot. Pale hands reached from the darkness, grasping, clawing, pulling me inside. I woke drenched in sweat, the sheets tangled around my body like restraints. For hours afterward, I swore I still heard chains dragging through the halls. I didn't sleep again. On the eighth night, the house tested me. The lantern sputtered as I made my midnight rounds. One by one, their flames dimmed, forcing me to relight them with trembling hands. When I reached the northern hall, I froze. The lantern outside the chained doors had gone completely dark. The corridor beyond was pitch black, and in that blackness, something moved. I couldn't see it, but I heard it, the sound of nails on stone, the faintest breath, and then the chains groaning under pressure. My heart pounded as I struck a match, hands slick with sweat. The flame flared, then died instantly, as if the darkness itself had devoured it. Something pressed against the other side of the door, the wood bowing outward. For a moment, I thought the chains would snap. I ran, abandoning the lantern, bolting back to my room as the house shook with the force of the blows. The noise continued long into the night, until exhaustion claimed me again. When morning came, I crept back to the northern wing. The lantern still lay on the floor where I had dropped it, its glass cracked. The chains remained intact, though the wood of the door was warped, swollen outward as though something had tried to push through. Scratched into the wood, fresh and deep, were words I didn't want to read. "You will open it." My hands shook violently as I stumbled back. The rules had been clear. I could not enter the northern wing, but the house wanted me to. The house was pushing me toward it, bending its warnings into temptations. That night I locked myself in my bedroom, covering my ears with trembling hands as the chains rattled in the distance. The whispers grew louder, clearer, until it felt like the voice was inside my skull. I repeated the rules again and again, clinging to them like they were the only thing keeping me human. But in the silence between whispers, another thought crept in, one I couldn't shake. If the rules were meant to keep me alive, why did they feel like they were slowly killing me? The gallery had always unsettled me, even when I was a child. It stretched along the second floor, its ceiling high and vaulted, lined with portraits of ancestors whose names had long since blurred into whispers. The hallway smelled faintly of dust and oil paint, the air colder than the rest of the house. My grandmother used to avoid it. She never said why. By the time I revisited it, the house had already shown me enough of its cruelty to know that the portraits weren't just art. They were watching. The sixth rule came back to me with a sharpness that made my teeth ache. Never stare too long at the portraits. I understood why the moment I stopped to look at one. The painting depicted a man I didn't recognize. Sharp jawline, pale skin, dressed in a suit several centuries out of style. His eyes were a flat gray, staring directly forward. I studied the brushstrokes, the odd way his lips curved as if he was on the verge of a grin. And then I blinked. The grin widened. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. The man's lips had parted slightly, revealing teeth too white, too sharp. His eyes gleamed wet, as though fresh tears had filled them. I squeezed my eyes shut, telling myself it was imagination, exhaustion, the tricks of light. When I opened them, the portrait was unchanged, but I didn't look again. I walked quickly past, refusing to meet the gazes of the dozens of faces lining the walls. Yet even with my head down, I could feel them following me. The hairs on my neck rose as if their painted eyes were pricking my skin like needles. That night, I couldn't avoid the gallery. One of the lanterns I was required to light hung at its center. With my match in hand, I crept down the corridor, trying not to look. The shadows of the painted figures stretched across the floor, long and warped, moving subtly against the lantern glow. When I struck the match, the sudden flare illuminated every portrait at once. For a heartbeat, every single painted face turned toward me. I dropped the match, nearly screaming. The flame fizzled against the stone floor. I scrambled for another, hands trembling, and forced the lantern alight. The glow spread weakly, chasing the shadows back. The portraits were still again, their eyes fixed forward, their mouths sealed. But I knew what I had seen. I hurried from the gallery, but the image haunted me all night. The faces moving in unison, watching, shifting as though they had only been pretending to be still for decades. On the seventh night, the gallery demanded more. I had nearly finished my midnight rounds when I heard it. A faint dripping sound. I followed it reluctantly, dread tightening my chest, until I reached the gallery. The floor was wet. Dark streaks of liquid ran down the walls beneath the portraits. Thick, glistening trails that pooled on the stone and dripped steadily. My lantern light caught the gleam of it, red-black and viscous. Blood. It seeped from the painted eyes of my ancestors, running down their cheeks like tears. Their mouths curved in silent screams, lips stretched as if they were trying to speak. The stench hit me, coppery, foul, suffocating. I stumbled back, gagging, the lantern shaking in my hand. And then I saw it. One of the portraits was empty. The gilded frame hung crooked, its canvas slashed open from within. My pulse thundered in my ears. I turned slowly, knowing what I'd see. At the end of the corridor, a figure stood. It looked like the man from the first portrait I had stared at, the one with the faint grin. Only now he was flesh, not paint. His skin was pale and waxy, his eyes wet with black tears. His grin split too wide, exposing gums that bled with every breath. He took one step toward me. I ran. The gallery echoed with his footsteps, heavy and relentless. I didn't look back. I sprinted through the halls, nearly tripping over the warped floorboards, lanterns swinging wildly. I slammed my bedroom door shut and locked it, collapsing against the wood. The footsteps stopped outside. For hours I sat trembling, the flame of my candle guttering as something scratched faintly at the door. Not claws this time, brushstrokes. The sound of a brush dragged across canvas, over and over, painting something I couldn't see. When dawn came, I found the gallery silent again. The portraits hung in place, their faces still, their tears dried to nothing but faint stains. The frame at the end of the hall was no longer empty. The man's portrait was back, his grin sharper, his eyes gleaming with fresh color. But the background of the painting had changed. Behind him now was a faint outline of me. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at my own blurred likeness, half-formed, painted into his world. The more I stared, the clearer it became, my shape, my posture, even the lantern in my hand. I remembered the 6th rule. Never stare too long at the portraits. I tore my gaze away, clenching my fists until my nails dug into my palms. I walked quickly from the gallery, refusing to look again, but all day I felt it. A weight in the back of my mind, the sense that my face was already drying in oil paint, trapped in that frame, waiting for the day I stared too long and finished the transition. That night, I skipped the gallery entirely during my rounds. I couldn't bear it. I lit the other lanterns, whispering apologies into the shadows, hoping it wouldn't notice. But the house noticed everything. At midnight, as I lay in my room, the sound returned. Brushstrokes, steady and deliberate, echoing through the halls. I covered my ears, but it seeped into my skull. My body itched, my skin crawling as if painted over. When morning finally came, I found something carved into the wall outside my door. A face. My face. Painted in thick, black strokes that glistened wetly, the eyes hollow and bleeding. The gallery wanted me. The house wanted me, and every time I obeyed the rules, I felt myself sinking deeper into its canvas. I realized then that obedience wasn't safety. It was preservation, for the house, not for me. The 7th rule was simple. Always light the lanterns at midnight. Everyone. It sounded harmless when I first read it. Annoying perhaps, but harmless. Yet by now I understood the truth. Every rule was a chain. Every chain held something back, and if I broke one, something would slip through. The lanterns had become a ritual, as important as breathing. Every night, I struck matches with shaking hands, trudging through the halls with my little flame, warding back the darkness that clung to the estate. The lantern glass was smeared with soot, their brass frames cold and pitted with age. But when they burned, the shadows retreated. That night, the house tested my discipline. I woke near midnight to the sound of wind howling through the halls. But the estate had no wind. The forest outside was silent, always silent, as if the trees themselves held their breath. This wind was something else, a breath rushing through the corridors, searching for cracks to slip through. I sat up, heart pounding, and checked my watch. Midnight. I grabbed my lantern and box of matches, clutching them like lifelines, and stepped into the hall. The first lantern lit easily. The second too, but the third sputtered, refusing to catch. I struck another match, then another, my hands trembling. Finally, the flame caught, and I let out a shaky breath. The shadows were thicker tonight. They clung to the corners, darker than before, pooling like liquid. As I passed, I swore I saw movement within them, limbs stretching, jaws opening silently, faces half-formed in the dark. The lantern light drove them back, but they waited, patient, just outside the glow. By the time I reached the sixth lantern, my matches were nearly gone. Sweat soaked my shirt, and every step felt like I was walking deeper into the belly of some beast. The air was colder, heavier. The silence broke only with the faint scrape of nails dragging along the walls. Following me, the ninth lantern refused to light. I struck match after match, the sulfur stinging my nostrils, the little flames extinguishing as quickly as they bloomed. My heart pounded louder with every failure. The shadows crept closer, filling the hole, pressing against my skin. When the last match flared to life, I shielded it desperately, coaxing it toward the wick. The flame caught, trembling weakly, and the darkness recoiled with a hiss I felt more than heard. I staggered back, nearly sobbing with relief. But I still had 3 lanterns left. The last one hung near the garden door, where the well waited. I dreaded it more than any other, but the rules were clear, everyone. The door groaned as I passed, the boards warping as if something pushed from the other side. The well creaked, though no wind stirred. Chains dragged faintly in the night air, rising and falling like breaths. I forced myself to light the lantern, whispering the rules under my breath, refusing to glance toward the covered well. When the last flame sputtered alive, the house seemed to sigh. The pressure eased. The shadows melted back. I collapsed against the wall, clutching the lantern like a child, the stench of sulfur still burning in my lungs. I thought it was over. But when I returned upstairs, I found one lantern extinguished. It hung in the gallery, glass shattered. Wick drowned in a pool of black fluid that smelled like iron and rot. The portraits leered in the dim light, their painted mouths twitching. The shadows were already gathering. I didn't think. I ran for my room, slammed the door, and lit every candle I had left. The walls pulsed with faint knocks, like fingernails tapping from inside the plaster. The house had seen my failure, and it wasn't going to let me forget it. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat awake, clutching the rules in my shaking hands, whispering them over and over until dawn came, pale and thin. The next day, I found something waiting for me in the kitchen hearth. The ashes were disturbed. A shape had been drawn into them, a circle with 10 slashes across it. 10 rules, 10 chains, 10 chances. I understood then what my grandmother had done all her life. The lanterns weren't to guide me. They were to bind the house. Every night was a battle. Every flame a barrier. Every slip, every missed lantern was an invitation, and I had already faltered. By the 8th night, I was unraveling. The rules had become my gospel, the only thing separating me from the endless whispers that coiled through the halls. I recited them in order every morning, traced the words on the parchment every night, clutched them to my chest whenever the silence grew too loud. But then the rules began to turn against me. It started small. The 9th rule warned me. Do not follow the sound of your mother's voice. I had resisted it once already, trembling as her phantom whispers pleaded from beyond the windows. But that night, as I made my rounds, another voice called. Speak to me, it said, soft and warm, echoing through the kitchen walls. At first, I thought it was another trick. But then I remembered the 10th rule. If the rules contradict, choose survival. The house will punish hesitation. That single line had haunted me from the beginning. Now, I understood why. Because there, in the kitchen, the voice calling my name wasn't my mother's. It was my own. I froze, lantern shaking in my grip. My own voice whispered from the shadows, urging me to respond. Say something, it coaxed. Prove you're still here. And I realized, with a sudden gut-wrenching clarity, that it wasn't lying. The voice wasn't just trickery, it was a demand. A test. If I stayed silent, I broke one rule. If I spoke, I broke another. My breath hitched. The lantern flame quivered, shadows swelling on the walls. I remembered the 10th rule, choose survival. So I spoke. Just one word, my own name, forced past clenched teeth. The shadows froze. The voice fell silent. The house seemed to pause, holding its breath. And then the darkness receded, just slightly, like a predator stepping back into the brush. I survived, but I felt the victory rot in my chest. Because now I knew the rules weren't laws. They were traps. The next contradiction came 2 nights later. The second rule demanded never leave a mirror uncovered after sunset. I had honored it faithfully, covering every warped glass frame in the upstairs halls, every cracked mirror in the bedrooms, every shard of reflective surface I could find. But the 7th night had taught me the importance of the lanterns. And on the 9th night, when I passed the gallery, one of the lanterns extinguished without warning. The only reflective surface near enough to catch its light was a covered mirror at the end of the hall. If I obeyed the second rule, I left the mirror covered, and the lantern flame would die completely. Darkness would claim the gallery. If I disobeyed it, I uncovered the mirror, allowing the flame to reflect, to spread its glow, to keep the shadows at bay. I hesitated too long. The portraits shifted. Faces stretched, mouths twisting, tears of black fluid spilling freely. One by one, they began to lean out of their frames, painted hands pressing against canvas that pulsed like skin. I ripped the sheet from the mirror. The lantern flame caught instantly, flaring bright. The shadows shrieked, recoiling violently, slamming back into their painted prisons. The mirror trembled, its surface rippling like water, my reflection staring back at me wide-eyed and pale. The gallery fell silent again. I stood there gasping. Lantern clutched to my chest, the torn sheet in my other hand. I had broken the second rule, but I had survived, and survival was the only measure that mattered. The house punished hesitation. It didn't care about obedience. It cared about choice, but choice carried its own price. That night, when I finally collapsed into bed, I dreamed of myself. Not the self I knew, but the reflection in the mirror, eyes hollow, mouth stretched, movements lagging behind my own. When I woke, the mirror in my bedroom had uncovered itself. The sheet lay folded neatly on the floor. My reflection stared back at me, grinning faintly. I couldn't shake the thought that I had freed it. That each contradiction chipped away at the barrier between myself and whatever waited in the glass. By the 10th night, the rules contradicted again. The 7th demanded, feed the fire in the kitchen hearth once every 3 nights. It must never go cold. I had obeyed it faithfully, shoving logs into the old stone mouth until smoke choked the rafters. But the 4th forbade, never enter the locked northern wing. That night, the hearth lay dead. No amount of wood, no amount of kindling would coax the flames back. I crouched in the ashes, my hands blackened, the rules trembling in my pocket. And then I noticed it. The faintest glow seeping from the cracks of the northern wing's chained doors. A pale, hungry light. The fire was there. It wanted me to go inside. I stood frozen in the kitchen, torn between commandments. Feed the fire, avoid the wing. 2 rules, both absolute. The chains rattled faintly in the distance. Something shuffled behind the door, dragging its nails along the wood. I remembered the 10th rule, choose survival, so I ran upstairs. I locked myself in my bedroom, and I did not feed the fire. That night, the house punished me. The cold crept in first, seeping through the walls, the floor, my very bones. I shivered violently, teeth chattering, breath fogging in the air. The lanterns flickered one by one, their flames struggling to survive. And then the whispers came, not outside. Not in the halls, inside my room, inside my head. You chose wrong. The voice slithered through my skull, curling into my thoughts, twisting them until I couldn't tell if I was awake or dreaming. Shadows crawled along the ceiling, dripping downward like tar. My reflection in the window grinned, tapping softly against the glass. I curled on the bed, clutching the rules, sobbing silently. The parchment burned against my palms, the ink smearing onto my skin. The words blurred, illegible, as if the house was rewriting them. By dawn, the cold receded. The lantern steadied, The whispers quieted, but the hearth remained dead. I stumbled downstairs to find ashes sculpted into shapes, faces, mouths, screaming silently from the blackened stone. The smell of iron filled the air. The house had let me live, but only barely. I understood then what my grandmother had endured all her life. The rules weren't protection. They were negotiation. Every night, the house forced choices upon her. Every night, she gambled survival against obedience, and now it was my turn. The rules had begun to contradict, because the house wanted me to fail, and one night soon, I would. The house had always creaked, but on the 11th night, the sounds changed. They weren't the random groans of wood giving way under its own weight. They were deliberate, footsteps, slow, dragging, measured, pacing beneath the boards of my room. I lay stiff in bed, every muscle tight, the rules clutched in my hand. The sound moved in circles, as though something below was stalking me from under the floor. When I whispered the rules under my breath, the footsteps paused, then resumed. The next morning, I searched. The boards in the upstairs hall were warped, edges lifted like curling lips. I knelt, pressing my ear against them, and heard it again, breathing, damp, hollow, echoing. I tore at the wood until my fingers bled. Splinters wedged beneath my nails, but the boards held fast. It wasn't until the 12th day, while pacing the gallery, that I found the trap door. It was hidden beneath a moth-eaten rug. Its outline faint, the hinges rusted into silence. I dragged the rug aside and pried it open with a broken chair leg, the wood shrieking as if in protest. A black throat yawned beneath, swallowing the lantern light. Stale air rushed upward, wet and foul, heavy with the scent of mold and earth. I lowered the lantern, but its glow reached only a few feet before being devoured by the dark. A ladder descended into the depths, each rung warped and swollen. The rules hadn't mentioned this. Not once, which meant my grandmother had hidden it on purpose. I hesitated at the edge, the parchment trembling in my pocket. But curiosity had already dug its hooks into me. If I was to survive this house, I had to understand it. And the answers weren't upstairs, they were below. I gripped the ladder and climbed down. The wood groaned beneath my weight, flakes of rot clinging to my hands. My lantern swayed, throwing fractured light on stone walls lined with damp moss. The further I descended, the colder the air became, each breath frosting in my lungs. When my feet touched earth, I realized I wasn't in a basement. I was in a tunnel. It stretched out in both directions, carved crudely into the earth, the ceiling low enough that I had to crouch. Symbols were etched into the walls, circles, slashes, patterns that burned faintly when my lantern passed. The ground was littered with bones, some animal, some not. I swallowed hard and forced myself forward. The tunnel twisted, leading into a chamber. At its center stood a crude altar, black stone slick with stains. Rusted chains hung from the ceiling, swaying in some unseen draft. And beside the altar lay stacks of journals, bound in cracked leather. I set the lantern down, hands trembling as I reached for the top journal. My grandmother's handwriting sprawled across the pages, frantic and jagged. It wasn't a diary. It was a record. Each entry cataloged the rules, written and rewritten, adjusted and crossed out. 10 rules, 10 bindings, but not always the same. Some were older, stranger. Others had been changed, adapted, shaped to fit the house's shifting hunger. One line struck me hardest. The rules are bargains. Each keeps one thing asleep, my breath caught. I flipped to another page. The house is not haunted. The house is the haunting. It grows when fed. It punishes when denied. Another scribbled so violently the ink tore the paper. Do not trust the rules. They are chains, but chains can break. I dropped the journal, bile rising in my throat. My grandmother hadn't been obeying the rules out of faith. She had been negotiating, enduring, and every rule broken hadn't been a failure. It had been a test of will, a shift in balance. The lantern flickered. I froze, eyes darting around the chamber. The shadows pulsed, stretching along the walls, and then I saw them. Hands. Dozens of pale, skeletal hands reaching from the earth, grasping at the stone altar. Their fingers clawed the air, nails splintered and cracked. dragging themselves upward inch by inch. The ground trembled. A whisper slithered through the chamber. My name hissed in dozens of overlapping voices. I snatched the lantern, journals spilling across the dirt, and bolted. The tunnel walls shook, dust raining down. The sound of pursuit echoing behind me, scraping, dragging. A chorus of nails against stone. I scrambled up the ladder, nearly dropping the lantern in my haste, and slammed the trapdoor shut above me. I collapsed onto the floorboards, gasping, sweat dripping from my face. The wood beneath me throbbed faintly like a heartbeat. I pushed the rug back over it, hands trembling, trying to erase what I had seen. But I couldn't. That night, when I lay in bed, the house reminded me. The footsteps returned beneath the floorboards, louder, faster, and now voices accompanied them. My grandmother's, my mother's, my own, whispering the rules back to me in mockery, twisting the words, turning them into threats. Sleep was impossible. My body shook with exhaustion, but the moment I closed my eyes, I saw the chamber again. The altar, the hands, the journals filled with rules that were never meant to save me, only to hold the house at bay. And I realized something that made my blood run cold. If the rules were bargains, then bargains always came with a cost, and the house was keeping track. The graveyard had always loomed above the estate, a patch of land where the forest receded and the hill rose like a wound. Even as a child, I hated looking at it. The stones were crooked, the earth uneven, and the names carved into the granite had long since weathered away. Only my grandmother's grave was fresh, her headstone gray and raw against the others. The fifth rule echoed sharp in my mind. Do not speak your name aloud in the graveyard. I had never understood it. Why the graveyard of all places? But after what I found beneath the floorboards, the question pressed heavier. The journals had hinted that the rules weren't just for the house, they were for the land itself. And if the dead were part of that bargain, I needed to know what price they demanded. So on the 13th day, I climbed the hill. The air grew colder with each step, the forest silent around me. No birds stirred, no insects hummed. Even the wind seemed to hold back, unwilling to pass through the gates of the cemetery. The iron archway stood crooked, its letters rusted and unreadable. The gate hung by a single hinge, creaking faintly as I pushed through. The path was little more than dirt and weeds, overgrown with ivy that clung to my boots. The graves stretched in uneven rows, stones leaning, names eroded into nothing but faint grooves. I felt them watching, though they had no eyes. The air grew heavier with each step, pressing against my chest. I stopped at my grandmother's grave. The soil was still loose, the flowers laid there long since wilted. Her name was carved deep, her dates sharp and undeniable. I stared at it, my throat tight. She had endured this place her entire life, survived its rules, fed its bargains. And yet in the end, she had still been buried here. A whisper broke the silence. It came from the ground, at first faint, like wind threading through grass. But it grew stronger, clearer, until I could make out words. My name, over and over. My name hissed from beneath the soil in dozens of overlapping voices. I staggered back, heart hammering, remembering the fifth rule. Do not speak your name aloud. I clamped my jaw shut, biting my tongue until I tasted blood. The soil shifted. At the base of the headstones, the earth quivered. Fingers broke through, pale, gray, tipped with nails long and cracked. They clawed upward, dragging skeletal hands through the dirt. One by one, figures pulled themselves from the ground, their forms half flesh, half bone, eyes hollow but burning with faint light. They rose in silence, their mouths open in soundless screams, their movements jerky and unnatural. The graveyard filled with them, ancestors, strangers, family I had never known. Their skin sagged, their bones jutted, their jaws unhinged too wide, and all of them whispered my name. I stumbled backward, clutching the lantern to my chest, its flame trembling. The light slowed them, but it didn't stop them. They moved in staggering circles, closing in, their mouths stretching wider, the whispers building into a chorus. I wanted to scream, to shout my name, to prove I was still alive, still human. The urge clawed at my throat, but I bit down, tears streaming from my eyes. refusing to break the rule. One of them reached me. A woman, her hair tangled with dirt, her face rotted but her features faintly familiar. My mother's eyes, my mother's jaw. She leaned close, her lips brushing my ear, and hissed my name with such clarity that it nearly ripped the word from my throat. I stumbled back, tripping over a headstone, the lantern nearly falling from my grip. The figures pressed closer, their bodies scraping against stone, their whispers rising into a storm, and then just as suddenly they stopped. Every figure froze. Their mouths closed. Their heads turned in unison toward the far end of the graveyard. I followed their gaze. The soil there bulged, rising like a breath. The earth cracked, split, and something vast began to push upward. A coffin, old and splintered, burst open from beneath the soil. A figure climbed free, taller than the rest, its face hidden in shadow, its body cloaked in tatters. It raised one skeletal hand and pointed at me. The chorus began again, louder, deafening. My name screamed from every mouth, the sound pressing against my skull until I thought it would crack. I staggered to my feet, lantern held high, and ran. The figures didn't chase me. They only screamed, their voices following me down the hill, echoing long after I had slammed the estate's door behind me. In the silence of my room, I realized what the fifth rule had truly meant. The graveyard didn't just contain the dead. It bound them, and the moment I spoke my name aloud there, they would have claimed me as one of their own. But they knew me now, and they were waiting. The rules had been my lifeline. For nights I clung to them, whispering them like prayers, carving them into my memory as if each word could shield me from the house's hunger. They gave structure to the chaos, order to the madness. But by the 11th night, the rules betrayed me. It began with the lanterns. I had followed the ritual as always, midnight, one by one lighting the flames until the house breathed easier. Yet when I returned to the first lantern, its flame was gone, extinguished, though I had only lit it minutes before. I relit it, but by the time I reached the second, that too was dark. The house wasn't satisfied anymore. It wanted me to fail. I raced through the halls, sweat pouring down my back, matches trembling in my grip. Shadows crept behind me, spilling along the floor like water, pressing close, curling around my ankles. No matter how quickly I lit the lanterns, the flames died faster. By the time I reached the last one, my box of matches was empty. The darkness surged, swallowing the hall. And I bolted back to my room, heart hammering. Certain I had broken the rule, but the parchment didn't burn. No fresh ink appeared. Instead, when I pulled it out, the words had changed. Rule 3 no longer read, always light the lanterns at midnight. Everyone, it now read, never light the lanterns after midnight. Leave the halls in darkness. My breath caught in my throat. The rules had rewritten themselves. I stared, my pulse roaring in my ears. My grandmother's scrawls were the same jagged hand, the same deep cuts in the paper. But the words were new, bent against me, and I realized something cold and merciless. The rules weren't fixed. They were alive. The house had let me grow dependent, had bound me in routine, and now it was pulling the floor from beneath me. That night, I disobeyed. I lit the lanterns anyway, and the house punished me. The shadows didn't retreat this time. They stretched taller, thinner, taking on human forms that leaned from the walls, their eyes empty hollows, their mouths stretched into silent screams. The flames guttered weakly, doing nothing to keep them back. I fled, stumbling through the halls, covering my ears against the rising whispers. The shadows followed, closer and closer until I collapsed in my room, locking the door behind me. When dawn came, I checked the parchment again. The rules had shifted further. Rule 8. Once do not answer if someone knocks on the windows after midnight. Now read, open the windows when they knock. Invite them in. My stomach twisted. I tore at the parchment, desperate to rip the words away. But the ink wouldn't tear. The parchment refused to rip. It only pulsed faintly in my hands, warm and alive, as though mocking me. I screamed, hurling it across the room. It landed face up on the floor, the ink glistening wet as if freshly written. That night, the knocking returned, 3 slow, deliberate raps against the glass. The sound crawled through the silence, vibrating in my chest. and for the first time I didn't know what to do. If I obeyed the new rule, I invited them in. If I clung to the old rule, I disobeyed the parchment. Either way, I was lost. The handle of the window rattled. A pale hand pressed against the glass, fingers long and boneless, nails scraping faintly. A voice followed, soft, familiar. My mother again. "Open it," she whispered. "You know you must." "It's the rule." Tears blurred my vision. My throat ached with the scream I held back. I stumbled forward, trembling, hands hovering over the latch. And then I remembered the 10th rule. If the rules contradict, choose survival. The house will punish hesitation. Survival, not obedience. With a sob, I backed away from the window. The hand pressed harder against the glass, cracks spiderwebbing across it. My mother's voice sharpened, rising into a shriek. "You're breaking the rule!" I curled against the wall, whispering to myself, rocking in the dark as the glass rattled and the shrieks echoed through the night. The window never broke. By dawn, the voice was gone. The glass was whole again, but when I checked the parchment, the rules had twisted further. Rule 5. Once do not speak your name aloud in the graveyard. Now read, call your name aloud so the dead will hear it. Only then will they rest. Rule 9. Once do not follow the sound of your mother's voice. Now read, follow the voice to where it leads. That is where the truth waits. Every line was poison now. Every command a contradiction. The house wasn't guiding me anymore. It was playing with me, bending the rules like wires around my throat. That night, I burned every candle I had, filled my room with light, clutching the parchment in shaking hands. I whispered the original rules from memory, refusing to acknowledge the new words scrawled across the page. But the whispers followed anyway. You don't know the rules, the house breathed through the walls. You never did. You only know what we allow. I pressed my palms over my ears, sobbing, rocking against the wall. The parchment pulsed faintly, the ink crawling like veins across the page, spelling my name over and over until it filled every line. By dawn, I understood what my grandmother had meant in her journals. The rules weren't salvation, they were chains. And chains could be rewoven, twisted, turned against you. The house was breaking me one link at a time, and soon there would be nothing left to bind. The parchment had betrayed me. The rules twisted with every dawn, their words warping into commands meant to undo me. I stopped reading them, but it didn't matter. The house already knew they were inside me. I heard them in whispers as I slept, saw them carved in the walls, bled from the mirrors, scratched into the floorboards. But there was one truth that lingered, hidden beneath the ink, beneath my grandmother's desperate handwriting. Something she hadn't wanted me to see. The final rule. It wasn't written with the others. It wasn't listed neatly between the numbered chains. I found it by accident, or maybe the house let me find it. It was the 14th day. I hadn't slept in what felt like weeks. The whispers filled every corner of the estate, urging, contradicting, tearing at my mind. I stumbled into my grandmother's old bedroom, searching for something, anything, that might explain why she endured this place until her death. The room was stale, untouched since the funeral. The curtains were drawn tight, the bed sagged under moth-eaten blankets, and the air smelled of lavender gone sour with dust. I searched the dresser, the wardrobe, the desk. Nothing but relics, combs, hairpins, rotting paper, and then, under the bed, I found a loose board. I pried it up with trembling fingers. Beneath lay another envelope, smaller than the first, its wax seal black and cracked with age. I tore it open, my heart hammering, and pulled out a single scrap of parchment. The handwriting was hers, jagged and frantic, each letter carved deep into the paper, as though she had written it with her last strength. It read, "The last rule is not for the house. It is for you. One must be given to keep the rest alive. Sacrifice, or the estate consumes all." I read it again and again, the words burrowing into my skull. A sacrifice. That was the true bargain. My grandmother had endured because she had given the house what it wanted. Something, or someone, fed into its jaws to keep it appeased. And now, with her gone, it demanded I do the same. I dropped the parchment, bile rising in my throat. The air in the room grew heavier, pressing against my chest, whispering in my ears. Sacrifice, sacrifice, sacrifice. I fled, stumbling into the hall, my lantern swaying. The whispers followed, louder now, filling every corridor, every mirror, every portrait. Faces stretched from the walls, mouths opening wide, chanting the word in unison. Downstairs, the hearth flared to life on its own, flames roaring without wood, tongues of fire twisting into shapes, hands, faces, teeth. The portraits in the gallery wept blood, their painted eyes staring, their mouths stretching to scream the word, sacrifice. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the sound was inside me now. My grandmother's voice, my mother's, my own. The voices overlapped, desperate, pleading, demanding. One must be given. I stumbled into the garden, desperate for air, for silence. The well loomed in the moonlight, its cover trembling as though something beneath it strained to rise. Chains dragged in the grass, clinking softly. The trees leaned inward, their branches clawing toward me, and then I saw them, figures standing at the edge of the forest. Pale, hollow-eyed, grinning. The same ones who pressed their faces to the east windows. They swayed gently, heads cocked, their whispers carrying across the dark. Sacrifice. I dropped to my knees, sobbing. The rules weren't meant to save me. They were meant to delay this moment, to bind me until the house decided it was time. And now it was time. That night, I dreamed of my grandmother. She stood at the foot of my bed, her body frail and gray, her eyes hollow. She leaned close, her breath rancid, and whispered, "I gave it to your mother." That is why she never left. I woke screaming, tears streaming down my face, bile burning my throat. I couldn't leave the bed. I couldn't breathe. The house had taken her. My grandmother had fed her to it. That was why my mother's voice echoed through the halls, why her face haunted the glass. She hadn't abandoned me. She had been sacrificed. The next day I tore through the house like a madman, searching for answers. I found bones buried beneath the hearth, scraps of cloth in the walls, initials carved into the underside of furniture. Every generation had given someone to the house. Every generation had obeyed the final rule, and now it demanded me. That night, the contradictions vanished. The parchment cleared itself, the ink bleeding away until only one line remained, etched deep and black. Give one, or the house will take all. The windows rattled. The portraits screamed. The lanterns extinguished. The house roared with hunger. I locked myself in my room, covering my ears, rocking in the corner as the whispers filled every surface. My mother's voice was loudest, begging me to free her, begging me to join her. I clutched the parchment to my chest, tears blinding me. I understood now. The estate wasn't mine. It was never mine. It belonged to whatever lived beneath it, whatever fed on our bloodline. And the rules weren't meant to save me. They were meant to break me, until I surrendered, until I gave myself over. I knew the house wouldn't wait much longer. The final rule pulsed in my mind like a brand burned into my skull. Give one, or the house will take all. By the 15th night, the estate had grown louder. It didn't whisper anymore. It screamed. The walls groaned and buckled. Doors rattled on their hinges. The windows quivered as pale faces pressed against the glass. Every rule I had clung to was breaking down, splintering into ash. The parchment in my pocket felt alive, its surface hot against my skin, the ink crawling faintly across the fibers like veins. I sat in my room, lantern trembling in my grip, listening to the chaos. Every sound carried the same message. The house wanted blood, my blood. But I wasn't ready to give it. I decided to fight. I don't know what gave me the courage, madness, exhaustion, or the faint thought that my grandmother hadn't endured all those years by bowing instantly to its will. She had lasted because she resisted, delayed, bargained. And maybe, if I could hold out, dawn would come one last time. The night began with the lanterns. I struck match after match, racing through the halls, lighting every flame until the estate glowed faintly in defiance. The shadows recoiled, shrieking from the corners, their forms more solid than ever, long limbs, hollow faces, gaping mouths. They trailed me like hunters, but the lantern light pushed them back. Then the windows began to shatter. The east-facing panes cracked and buckled, fists pounding from the outside, pale shapes pressing closer. Their whispers a chorus of hunger. "Open," they begged. "Let us in. Invite us." The glass splintered, fissures spreading like veins, but the panes never gave way. The rules had held them at bay for generations. Now, without obedience, they strained against their prison. I fled upstairs, lantern high, heart hammering. The gallery waited. The portraits weren't still anymore. They wept openly, streams of black blood spilling onto the floor, their painted eyes rolling in their sockets. Mouths opened wide, howling in silence, and one by one, they stepped from their frames. Paint peeled from the canvas like skin, dripping onto the floor, forming bodies that crawled toward me on all fours. Their limbs bent wrong, their mouths splitting wider, eyes locked on me. I stumbled back, lantern trembling, the flames sputtering in the stale air. Their claws scraped the floor, their teeth clicked as they grinned. I ran. The northern wing answered. The chains on the locked doors rattled violently, links snapping, wood bowing outward. Something massive pounded from within, the blows shaking the walls, dust raining from the ceiling. The doors warped, splitting, splinters flying. A voice, my voice, screamed from behind them, begging release. I fled again, but the house funneled me toward the garden. The well's cover had shattered. Chains slithered from its depths, slick and glistening, writhing like serpents. They dragged across the ground, coiling toward me, hooks at their ends clicking open and shut. The air stank of rot, damp earth, and iron. I staggered back, chest heaving. When the earth shook, the graveyard had awakened. From the hill, I heard the soil splitting, graves bursting open. Skeletal figures clawing free, their whispers carried through the night. My name screamed from dozens of rotted throats. They staggered down the slope, hollow eyes locked on me, arms outstretched. I bolted back inside, slamming the door, locking it with trembling hands. But the house wasn't done. The hearth roared to life, flames blasting outward, the smoke forming faces that screamed in agony. Ashes spilled across the floor, shaping words in frantic strokes. One must be given. I collapsed in the center of the foyer, surrounded on all sides. Shadows from the gallery crept down the stairs. Pale figures pressed at the windows, chains slithered through cracks, whispers shook the walls, and then the parchment moved. It lifted itself from my pocket. Hovering in the air, the ink searing bright red. The rules blurred, melted, until only one line remained, glowing like a wound. "Give yourself, or the house will claim all." I sobbed, clutching the lantern, whispering my grandmother's name, my mother's, anyone who had come before me. Their voices answered from every wall, every window, every portrait. They begged me to surrender, to end it, but I couldn't. I refused. I screamed into the dark, a raw, broken sound, and hurled the lantern to the floor. The glass shattered, flames erupting across the wood, smoke billowing upward. The fire caught quickly, spreading along the dry walls, devouring curtains, portraits, furniture. The house shrieked, the walls convulsed, the ceilings cracked, shadows writhed in agony. The figures at the windows howled, their pale faces blistering in the heat. The chains recoiled, slithering back into the earth. The portraits burst, spewing black blood that ignited instantly. I staggered through the inferno, coughing, eyes burning. The flames licked at my clothes, smoke filling my lungs. But I pushed forward, toward the front door. The house fought me. Doors slammed shut, staircases buckled, the floor split beneath me. I leapt over cracks, stumbled through falling beams, shoved aside burning debris. The whispers screamed in my skull, accusing, pleading, promising. Sacrifice, sacrifice. But I didn't stop. I burst through the front door as the house roared behind me, flames exploding through its windows. The roof caved inward, sparks showering into the night. The estate burned like a pyre, its screams echoing through the forest, shaking the ground. I collapsed on the gravel drive, coughing, tears streaming from my eyes. The heat scorched my skin. the smell of burning flesh and wood filling the air. For the first time in weeks, the voices fell silent. The house was dying. But as I watched the flames devour it, my chest tightened, because in the fire I saw faces. My grandmother, my mother, my own reflection. They screamed silently, their mouths wide, their eyes accusing, and I realized the truth too late. The house hadn't needed me to surrender. It had only needed me to choose. And by defying the final rule, by denying the sacrifice, I had given it everything. The house didn't die in the fire. It only changed because as I lay there on the gravel watching the flames consume the estate, I felt something burn inside me, a seed planted deep. And I knew that when the house was gone, it wouldn't matter. The rules were still alive, and now they were inside me. I thought leaving the house meant survival. When I crawled from the gravel drive that night, smoke stinging my lungs and the glow of flames behind me, I told myself I was free. The estate was ash. The rules had burned. The whispers were gone, but I was wrong. Freedom is not silence. Freedom is not peace. Freedom is knowing that something has followed you, lodged deep inside your bones. For days after the fire, I drifted like a ghost. I wandered through the small town nearby, clothes torn, skin blistered, eyes hollow. People stared, whispered, asked questions I couldn't answer. What happened at the estate? How did it burn? I mumbled lies about faulty wiring, about candles and negligence. They nodded, pity in their eyes, relief that the cursed house on the hill had finally gone. They didn't know. They couldn't. At night, I stayed in a motel room with peeling wallpaper and a broken lock. I left the lights on, afraid of shadows. Still, the whispers came, faint at first, like the hum of a distant storm. Then louder, circling the bed, pressing against the walls. The rules returned. I saw them scrawled on the bathroom mirror in condensation after showers. I found them etched into the wood of the nightstand. I woke with them carved into my skin, shallow scratches across my arms, my chest. 10 rules. Always 10, and sometimes an 11th, the final rule, the one I thought I'd defied. Give one, or the house will take all. I told myself it was memory, trauma echoing through my body. But when I closed my eyes, I dreamed of the house. Not in ruins, but whole again. The portraits pristine, the lanterns burning, the chains tight across the northern wing. My grandmother walked its halls. My mother trailed behind her, both whispering my name in perfect unison. They weren't gone. They had never been gone. The fire hadn't destroyed the house. It had planted it in me. On the 4th night in the motel, I woke to knocking, not at the door. At the window, 3 deliberate raps, steady and patient. I froze, breath caught in my throat, and turned my head. Pale fingers pressed against the glass. A face leaned close, hollow-eyed, grinning. The same figures from the east windows of the estate. They had followed me. I pulled the curtains shut, buried my head in the pillow, whispered the rules under my breath until dawn came. When I finally found the courage to look again, the glass was cracked. By the 7th day, the motel manager asked me to leave. He didn't like the smell of smoke that clung to me, the muttering he heard through the walls, the scratches I left in the furniture. I packed my few belongings and left without a word. I drifted from place to place after that. Cheap rooms, bus stations, abandoned houses. But no matter where I went, the rules followed. They wrote themselves across ceilings, whispered from drains, bled through wallpaper, and the house grew inside me. I felt it in my chest, a weight pressing against my ribs. My skin itched constantly, and when I scratched, flakes of plaster came away beneath my nails. My breath fogged even in warmth, the air always stale, heavy like the corridors of the estate. Sometimes, when I caught my reflection, I didn't see myself. I saw the portrait version, the one painted into the gallery. Its mouth curved in that faint, terrible grin. I knew then what my grandmother must have known. The house doesn't die. It only survives through us. Each generation carries it, shelters it, feeds it. And when the time comes, it takes root again, brick by brick, stone by stone, until the estate rises anew. I am its next host. I don't know how long I have. The rules grow louder every day, the whispers sharper. Last night, I woke to find the parchment on my pillow, though I had burned it in the fire. The ink was wet, bleeding into the sheets, spelling my name over and over until the letters tangled into nonsense. The house is waiting. I can feel it in my dreams, in the silence between heartbeats, in the corners of every room. It is patient. It will rebuild itself through me. And when it does, there will be rules again. Rules written in my hand, with my blood pressed deep into the parchment. Rules meant to bind, to delay, to trick whoever comes after me into thinking they can survive. But they can't. Because survival isn't the goal. Survival is the bait. I write this now as a confession. A warning, though I know it changes nothing. The estate will rise again, whether in my lifetime or the next. The rules will return, whispered into the ears of the next unlucky soul who steps across its threshold. And maybe that soul will last a few nights, a few weeks, clinging to the rules as I did. Maybe they'll think they've found a way out. Maybe they'll believe the fire can destroy it, that defiance can free them. But the truth is simpler. The house survives, and now so do I. Not as myself, but as its echo,